without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Casey and Jill. If you guys have questions, you want to unmute yourselves, that would be great, or type them in the chat, and we'll go from there. So Casey, Jill, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. My name's Casey Filipino, and I'm going to kick things off this morning, and Jill will be introducing herself here shortly. And just as a really quick intro, Tim and I's kids play Little League together, so this was a really very naturally organic presentation and collaboration that we've got going on here. And so this is kind of new to Jill and I. We work for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. So briefly, I'm going to talk about who we are and what we do, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jill, and she's going to get into the meat of our discussion today. So again, we work for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, where we represent 17 member localities. Not all of them are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but a majority of them are. And so I work in the Water Resources Department with Jill. There's 6 of us total in the department, and I've been there for about 4 years. I specifically work on Chesapeake Bay initiatives and stormwater. But we also dabble in all kinds of other issues with coastal resiliency, drinking water, and water quality. So with that, Jill, I'm going to let you go ahead and take over, and then I will be back later at the end of the presentation. But go ahead, Jill.
Well, thank you, Casey, and good morning, everybody. And thanks to Tim for having us. Like Casey mentioned, my name's Jill Sunderland. I also work in the Water Resources Department at the Planning District. And I focus primarily on state water policies and stormwater quality too. So today I'm going to start off with, what is the purpose of the Bay Act? And, why did Virginia create this to begin with? If you want to move to the next slide, Casey. So over 30 years ago, back 1980s, people were recognizing that we had increases in population, we had increases in development, and that this was having an impact on the Chesapeake Bay and the waters that feed into it. For example, they were seeing more algae blooms, they were seeing decline in fisheries, and really connecting those sort of, that kind of degradation to the land use. And Virginia took it upon themselves to say, okay, how can we create this balance so that we are encouraging economic development, however, minimizing that development's impact on the Chesapeake Bay? So they tried to strike this balance and basically create a state program that would be run by localities. And the Bay Act was established in 1988. And like I mentioned, it requires coastal localities. And this is not just limited to Hampton Roads. There are actually 84 localities in Virginia that are subject to the Bay Act. So this is a common issue with a lot of the localities in Virginia. And what they were recognizing is that, they could tie the water quality condition to the uses of the land adjacent to the waterway. And particularly, they wanted to protect the most sensitive lands of all, which is the resource protection buffer, which is that 100-foot strip of land right adjacent to the waterway. So they created this program specifically for those sensitive lands. You can go to the next one. And I wanted to start with a little bit of background just to see how that development is really leading to the impacts in the waterways. And as you can see from these illustrations that, when you have a vegetated lot, a wooded area that's covered with trees, shrubs, plantings, grasses, all of that, when you have precipitation, most of that is just going to soak into the ground. You don't have a lot running off the property. However, when you add development and start building houses and driveways and adding hard surfaces, you actually limit the amount of precipitation that can soak into the ground. And you create what's called stormwater runoff. And with the low density here in the middle, you can see that about 10 or 30% of that precipitation would become runoff. However, when you have a whole neighborhood built out, you can see that it would be, the medium density development. Now we're looking at, more than half of precipitation actually becomes runoff. And Casey, you want to move to the next one? And the idea really is like, okay, so we've added development, we've added population growth, there's more runoff. What's the big deal with that? Well, there's 2 primary concerns with that in terms of water quality. Number one, when you have this runoff, it doesn't just go directly into the waterway. On the way to the waterway, as stormwater runoff flows over the ground, it picks up various pollutants along the way. When you think about waterfront lots, you think about, there could be pet waste in the lawn, there could be extra fertilizers, things like that. So when the precipitation overflows the land, it picks up those pollutants and carries them to the waterway. Additionally, when you have more development and more hard surfaces, the runoff actually moves faster over the land, and that contributes to shoreline erosion. Nice. There are some things that homeowners can do when they live on the waterway like that to try to control runoff. The first thing is just to reduce those hard surfaces. The more pervious surface we have, the more of the water can be infiltrated at the site. We want to keep the storm drains clear. We want to only use the amount of fertilizer that we really need, encourage soil tests and things like that so that excess fertilizer isn't applied in the first place. But one of the biggest things that we can do, that a homeowner can do to prevent impacts of land development on waterways, is to preserve that vegetated buffer. That 100-foot strip of land adjacent to the waterway is really important, and that's why the Chesapeake Bay Act is focused on that specific part of the landscape. You go to the next one. So there are a whole list of things that are beneficial about the buffer. The most important of which is that it traps these pollutants. When you have the runoff flowing through the buffer, it actually slows down, it infiltrates a lot of the water, and the pollutants are actually soaked up by the plants. So it prevents them from reaching the waterway. It also slows down the flow in general and reduces erosion problems. Now, there are all kinds of other benefits as well, including, I mentioned the stabilizing the shoreline, but also, aquatic habitat, temperature reduction, provides shade. The aesthetic benefit. There is a lot to be gained from preserving this buffer. But really the way that the Bay Act considers it is just that last line of defense to protect the water from the impacts of the land. You go to the next one. So after kind of covering all of that part, the question becomes, what is the impact to waterfront homeowners? So we know, if you want to move to the next one, Casey, that homeowners are buying these waterfront lots and they want to improve their view. They want to add sheds, additions. They're going to build decks, patios. They want to install a pool. They want to build a pathway, driveways, all of these types of projects. And the question is, how does the Bay Act play into these types of projects? And if you move to the next slide, Casey, it really does go into, what is allowed in the buffer. So you can have improved sight lines, think filtered views that still contain trees and understory. You can do the access paths, creating access for boating and swimming. You can do tree maintenance, think about, after a storm or something like that, you have damaged vegetation or, a diseased tree that needs to be removed, that kind of thing. And you also can do shoreline management projects, particularly if you have structures on the lot that are threatened by erosion or you have significant annual property loss. Something that's important to mention, I think, about this part is that I decided to focus right here just on the types of projects that homeowners are likely to take on and want to do on their properties. However, there is a whole other category of development that is allowed in the buffer, specifically for, think like utilities and roadways, encroachments, that kind of thing, that have specific conditions that they have to meet in order to do these types of projects. But I wanted to focus on what homeowners would be most interested in. And I really think those views and kind of the tree maintenance is a big part of it. And if they want to do projects like that, if you go to the next slide, Casey, there is definitely a catch. They most likely are allowed to do all of those types of things. However, we have to remember that that buffer, that 100-foot width strip of land, is protected by both the Bay Act at the state level and by local ordinance by the city or county. And the localities are required to administer programs that protect that vegetation and those sensitive lands right along the waterway. And typically what is required is that a homeowner would have to fill out a permit application with the locality. They would identify, describe their property, when it was platted, how much impervious area they have or hardened surfaces, what they're going to add, what they have to do in order to add the project. Are they cutting down trees? Are they, bringing in concrete? Are they, basically what kind of equipment they have to use, stuff like that. What's going to be the impact? And then they have to include on that application the types of steps they're going to take to minimize their impact to water quality. One of the examples is like, okay, are you going to avoid that really mature tall tree on the lot and go to, move the path so that it doesn't impact that tree? Or can you move the pool closer to the house so that it's not so close to the waterway? One of the common ones too is, you're going to put in that access path down to the water, but maybe it doesn't need to be concrete. It could actually be mulched instead. This whole idea of kind of reducing the hardened surfaces and replacing any plantings that you may have to remove in order to do your project is called a mitigation measure. And many of those are required in order to kind of offset the impact of that new development. And there's a whole application. Each locality has a different one. So it's important to realize that, Virginia Beach's process is going to be slightly different from Norfolk's. You will notice that particularly both of those localities are particularly protective of the 50-foot seaward portion of the buffer. So there's the 100-foot buffer, and then there's extra sensitive, the ones that's 50 feet closer to the waterway. And there's specific applications and permits and that kind of thing that you have to fill out with the city. It's important to note that not all projects are going to be able to meet those requirements based on, how big the lot is, or maybe you can't move the pool. There's only this one place to put it, or the shed, or what have you. And if you can't meet those mitigation measures, the homeowner would be required to file an exception request with the local Chesapeake Bay Preservation Board. And you would basically take that to the board and say, I can't do this mitigation measure, but I can plant trees on this side. Can I have an exception from the requirements? And there's a Bay board in each locality that is elected or appointed, I think, by city council. And they would decide then that, yes, you can do it, or no, you can't do it. What's really important to realize too is that the homeowners need to go to the locality before the project. What has happened is that people get fined with violations because the locality learns of the project after the fact, and there was no application, there were no mitigation measures taken, and they are then required to, I've heard of violations resulting in fines. I've heard of them resulting in additional mitigation measures, maybe even having to move the shed, or not put so much concrete around the pool to create that decking or whatever. So I would strongly advise that the homeowners would go to the local staff before their project is installed, make sure everything is square. Not to mention the permits aren't very expensive or anything. The local staff is ready to help advise, look at drawings, maps with different homeowners, and really make sure that they're doing things on the up and up with these ordinances.